everyone. Welcome to The Breakdown. I'm Diane Macedo.
And I'm Terry Moran. The Biden administration is under pressure to act after the Supreme Court this week refused to block a Texas law that effectively bans abortions in that state. Now, Attorney General Merrick Garland is expected to make an announcement any moment on federal action to block that law. We're going to bring you that live when it happens.
And President Biden is set to announce new vaccine requirements for federal workers and lay out a 6-point strategy to fight the Delta variant. Meanwhile, hospitalizations are on the rise in the Northwest and Upper Midwest. We'll break down what's next in the fight against COVID-19.
And as we approach the 20th anniversary of September 11th, we're examining the consequences of the terror attacks over the past 2 decades, including the United States treatment of those suspected of being responsible. We're going to take a hard look at the role of Guantanamo Bay after 9/11 in housing suspected terrorists captured in the so-called global war on terror.
We begin with the Biden administration under pressure to take action on abortion rights after Texas implemented a new law banning abortion after roughly 6 weeks of pregnancy. Now, the Texas law states, quote, a physician may not knowingly perform or induce an abortion if the physician detects a fetal heartbeat. Now, again, that could be as early as 6 weeks into pregnancy, before some women even know they're pregnant. There are no exceptions for rape or incest, only for medical emergencies. It also empowers private citizens to bring lawsuits against anyone who helps a woman obtain an illegal abortion, offering a monetary reward of at least $10,000 to plaintiffs who win. So let's bring in congressional correspondent Rachel Scott and White House correspondent Mary Alice Parks for a little bit more on this. Rachel, I want to start with you because you were in Texas last week. What impact has this law had so far?
A significant impact, Diane. I could tell you from speaking with abortion providers there in Texas that abortions have all but stopped in the state. About 80 to 85% of women in the state of Texas get abortions after 6 weeks of pregnancy. And you said it, this law effectively bans abortions as early as 6 weeks into a woman's pregnancy. I was inside of a Planned Parenthood clinic right there in Houston, and they told me that they have been flooded with calls, that their call center has now turned into a crisis hotline with women calling and trying to get access to an abortion in a different state. We also talked to clinics in nearby states like Oklahoma, who said that now they are seeing dozens and dozens of calls from women who are willing to travel, hundreds of miles in order to get an abortion. But this law specifically also will target a lot of women, women of color, low-income women who do not have the ability, who cannot afford to go out of state for that option. So there is no underestimating the significant effect that this has had, and it was designed to be such a powerful effect, Diane.
Precisely, Rachel. Designed also to evade the federal courts. Mary Alice, this is a deviously, almost cynically designed law because it empowers those private citizens and offers them bounties to stop the abortions in that state, not by going after the women, but by going after anyone who, quote, aids and abets her. That could be her family members, the doctors and clinics, of course, even an Uber driver. And that makes it very hard for judges to get on top of this and find a way to stop it. These are private lawsuits. So what do you think the Justice Department has up its sleeve here?
Well, Terry, first, it's exactly that unique component of the law that seems to be top of mind for the president. While we've seen the White House very vocal in its opposition to this Texas law, the president has only spoken about it once. And when he took questions on it, he really zeroed in on exactly what you're talking about. He called that part of the law nearly un-American. He said that it seemed like a vigilante system. So I expect that we're going to see the Justice Department really try to say that it is the enforcement mechanisms of this law that don't sit well next to federal law. They're going to say it keeps federal agents from being able to do their work. We don't know for sure. The Justice Department has been pretty tight-lipped on this, but the White House has been facing a lot of pressure from fellow Democrats to do something.
We're going to go straight to the Attorney General there in Washington.
Good afternoon. Last week, after the Supreme Court allowed Texas Senate Bill 8 to take effect, I said that the Justice Department was evaluating all options to protect the constitutional rights of women and other persons. Today, after a careful assessment of the facts and the law, the Justice Department has filed a lawsuit against the state of Texas. Our position is set out in detail in our complaint. Its basis is as follows. SB 8 bans nearly all abortions in the state after 6 weeks of pregnancy. before many women even know they are pregnant and months before a pregnancy is viable. It does so even in cases of rape, sexual abuse, or incest. And it further prohibits any effort to aid the doctors who provide pre-viability abortions or the women who seek them. The act is clearly unconstitutional under long-standing Supreme Court precedent. Those precedents hold, in the words of Planned Parenthood versus Casey, that, quote, regardless of whether exceptions are made for particular circumstances, a state may not prohibit any woman from making the ultimate decision to terminate her pregnancy before viability. Texas does not dispute that its statute violates Supreme Court precedent. Instead, the statute includes an unprecedented scheme to, in the Chief Justice's words, quote, insulate the state from responsibility, close quote. It does not rely on the state's executive branch to enforce the law, as is the norm in Texas and everywhere else. Rather, the statute deputizes all private citizens without any showing of personal connection or injury to serve as bounty hunters, authorized to recover at least $10,000 per claim from individuals who facilitate a woman's exercise of her constitutional rights. The obvious and expressly acknowledged intention of this statutory scheme is to prevent women from exercising their constitutional rights by thwarting judicial review for as long as possible. Thus far, the law has had its intended effect. Because the statute makes it too risky for an abortion clinic to stay open, abortion providers have ceased providing services. This leaves women in Texas unable to exercise their constitutional rights and unable to obtain judicial review at the very moment they need it. This kind of scheme to nullify the Constitution of the United States is one that all Americans, whatever their politics or party, should fear. If it prevails, it may become a model for action in other areas, by other states, and with respect to other constitutional rights and judicial precedents. Nor need one think long or hard to realize the damage that would be done to our society if states were allowed to implement laws that empower any private individual to infringe on another's constitutionally protected rights in this way. The United States has the authority and the responsibility to ensure that no state can deprive individuals of their constitutional rights through a legislative scheme specifically designed to prevent the vindication of those rights. The United States also brings this suit to assert other federal interests that SB 8 unconstitutionally impairs. Among other things, SB 8 conflicts with federal law by prohibiting federal agencies from exercising their authorities and carrying out their responsibilities under federal laws relating to abortion services. It also subjects federal employees and non-governmental partners who implement those laws to civil liability and penalties. Among the federal agencies and programs whose operations the statute unconstitutionally restricts are the Labor Department's Job Corps program, the Defense Department's TRICARE Health program, the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the Bureau of Prisons, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and the Office of Personnel Management. The complaint therefore seeks a declaratory judgment that SB 8 is invalid under the Supremacy Clause and the 14th Amendment, is preempted by federal law, and violates the doctrine of intergovernmental immunity. The United States also seeks a permanent and preliminary injunction prohibiting enforcement of the statute against the state of Texas, including against the state's officers, employees and agents, and private parties it has effectively deputized who would bring suit under SB 8. The Department of Justice has a duty to defend the Constitution of the United States and to uphold the rule of law. Today, we fulfill that duty by filing the lawsuit I have just described. Now, before I take some questions, I want to say a few words to the American people on the eve of the 20th anniversary of the attacks of September 11th, 2001. That day is seared into all of our memories. Nothing we can do or say can replace the loss so many endured that day. Nothing can change the profound way the events of September 11th altered us, individually and collectively as a nation. And let there be no doubt, the threat from terrorists, from foreign terrorists, like those involved in the September 11th attack, is one we must constantly guard against. But what we can do, and what we have done, is learn from the past to better anticipate and prepare for the next threat and to seek to disrupt it. As we mark this anniversary, we rededicate ourselves at the Justice Department to doing all we can to protect the American people from terrorism in all its forms, whether originating from abroad or at home, and to doing so in a manner that is consistent with our values and the rule of law. With that, I'm happy to take questions.
All right, Jeff, you want to kick us off?
Attorney General Garland, is there a provision in the Texas law that you personally find especially concerning?
Well, I think I've described all of the provisions that I find especially concerning, and the complaint does that in even more detail, so I wouldn't pick any one.
So there's been several GOP lawmakers who said that they will follow Texas's lead, and I was wondering if you expect DOJ to be involved in similar actions against other states. Like, would it be a leap to say that this could be one of several similar actions?
Well, as I said in my remarks, the risk here, the greater risk here, the additional and further risk here is that other states will follow similar models with respect not only to this constitutional right, but theoretically against any constitutional right and in any other state. So if another state uses the same kind of provisions to deprive its citizens of their constitutional rights, and in particular to deprive their citizens of the ability to seek immediate review, we will bring the same kind of lawsuit.
So there had been some pressure, it seems, from Democratic lawmakers on the Hill and anti-abortion groups, and even some could argue from the White House on the Department of Justice to do something about this Texas law. Did you feel any of that pressure? Did that play any role in this?
The Department of Justice does not file lawsuits based on pressure. We carefully evaluated the law and the facts, and this complaint expresses our view about the law and the facts.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
All right, well, there you have it. Attorney General Merrick Garland there declaring that the Department of Justice, the federal government, is going to sue the state of Texas over that state's new abortion law. One of the questions about this law, this very cleverly designed law, was because it was structured in such a way that the state itself, no officer of the state was to be prosecuted. No officer of the state was exercising power against a woman. It empowered private citizens to go after the people who were helping the women. As I say, rather devious. So who could be enjoined? Who could be sued? And Merrick Garland just went big. He said, Texas gets sued. That the state of Texas, he says, is defying that clause in the Constitution which declares that the Constitution of the United States is the supreme law of the land, the supremacy clause in the Constitution, and the 14th Amendment, which guarantees its protections to all people, equal protection under that law across the country. So he basically says that this scheme to stop abortion in Texas is in defiance of the Constitution in the most basic way imaginable, and he's bringing in the big guns of the federal government's Department of Justice in order to stop it. We'll see how it's going on that.
All right, so for more on this, let's bring in congressional correspondent Rachel Scott, White House correspondent Mary Alice Parks, and ABC News political contributor Sarah Isgur, who's on the phone with us. Sarah, I'll start with you. How strong is the Attorney General's case here against this Texas law?
So I'm just starting to read the complaint that they've issued publicly, and it all turns on who the United States can sue. As Terry just said, they have brought this suit against Texas, which the United States can sue a state, unlike private individuals often. But they're claiming that the reason they can sue Texas is under something called the state action doctrine. They're arguing that by empowering individuals in the state to bring these bounty hunting lawsuits, the state those private people are actually functioning as agents or arms of the state. That's a pretty novel theory, one that would have far-reaching implications on a lot of civil lawsuits, potentially. I don't know how successful, therefore, this lawsuit will be. On the other hand, it will show the courts just how important it is to find a vehicle to make sure these laws can be challenged. As the Attorney General said, this is not actually just about abortion rights. This is a question over whether the courts are functioning to protect all sorts of constitutional rights, and this is just the first case to do so.
Exactly, Sarah, if I can just follow up on that. That is a very interesting question because there is, as I say, no officer of the state government of Texas who is acting here under this law. It will be private citizens. But absent the payment by the treasurer of Texas or whomever of up to $10,000 or beyond for a bounty to file these lawsuits if they are successful, there would be no manner of enforcing these laws. And I just wonder if there is weakness, as you sense, perhaps, in the Department of Justice's position, then Texas has set an example
you have the problem that actually came up in the. Oh, I'm sorry. Was that? Sorry, Terry.
Well, yeah. The question is. It just seems that any state could get away with something similar on gun rights, on all these rights, as long as they scheme it and structure it in this very clever way that Texas has done.
That's exactly right, and that's the problem, that the initial lawsuit that caused this whole beginning, where the Supreme Court declined to prevent this law from going into effect, those plaintiffs had sued, those private plaintiffs had sued state judges, arguing similar to what you just said, well, without a state judge to oversee these lawsuits, maybe they are the state actors. Here, the United States is saying, no, the state has turned every private individual into state actors. Neither of those have a lot of precedent in the law, however.
All right, Mary Alice, the Biden administration is under this tremendous pressure. People's constitutional rights have been denied in the state of Texas, so they're under pressure to take action. As Sarah just said, since the Supreme Court just didn't do anything here. So how do you think this decision played out between the White House and DOJ?
Well, Terry, listening to Mary Carlin, I was thinking a lot about a conversation I had with progressive lawmakers over the weekend who are adamant that the real answer is a legislative one, that fundamentally they know there's going to continue to be questions of the constitutionality of a woman's right to an abortion that continue to come before the Supreme Court as long as there is a conservative majority on the bench. And so progressives think the only real answer is to put something in federal law that codifies a woman's right to choose, so that basically let Congress get the upper hand instead of the Supreme Court. You know, it was interesting that the Attorney General continued to refer to a woman's right to choose as a constitutional right. Obviously, that's their stance, but it goes to a political question as well, because we've heard a lot of Democrats say that maybe the Senate should carve out rules around constitutional rights in any effort to get around the filibuster. I know we're talking about a lot of like Washington insider talk here, but we know that Democrats don't have 60 votes in the Senate, but they have 50. And there's been a big conversation among Democrats about whether they should carve out things that impact constitutional rights, like voting or like a woman's right to choose. And so I think that we're going to hear Democrats on Capitol Hill continue to hammer this idea that there should be a carve out in filibuster rules in the Senate for legislation that gets at constitutional rights as Democrats view them.
And Rachel, we heard the Attorney General say that the law makes it so risky for an abortion clinic to stay open that abortion providers have effectively stopped providing services altogether. You were in Texas last week. Does that jive with what you saw and heard there?
Exactly, and that's exactly what I was hearing from a lot of smaller abortion providers, that this law would have a chilling effect, that this law for them could push them into bankruptcy. It could drain their financial resources to the point where their only option is to close. This is obviously not the first law. It's not the first bill that has been proposed in Texas that have limited access to abortion. It was already pretty hard as it is to get an abortion in Texas. And it's interesting to note that the amount of clinics have dwindled. They have actually grown smaller over the course of the last few years because of how many restrictions have been in place by the state of Texas. Abortion providers point to abortion services as a very small amount sometimes of what they offer at some of these healthcare clinics, mammograms, birth control. They offer other healthcare services as well, and now women won't have access to that if these clinics do close down. We could see that obviously shrink. I also thought it was pretty notable there that the Attorney General talked about what effect this could have on other states. And we have already seen other states, I can name already 3, Florida, Arkansas, South Dakota, who have expressed interest in wanting to mirror the law there in Texas. They want to use that as a blueprint to then create something similar in their own states, which is why we are hearing Democrats come out in force saying that there needs to be action on this. We know that the House is going to try and take up this issue, try and pass something that secures the right to abortion for women in this country when they return from recess. But I can tell you from talking to many moderate senators on Capitol Hill, that is likely to go nowhere in the Senate.
And Rachel, you've talked about the way this almost has a contagious power, this Texas scheme to evade federal judicial review. You were on the ground in Texas doing that great reporting when this law essentially went into effect. Have you heard from abortion rights activists or people who are invested in other civil rights, gun rights, for example, concern that this kind of thing is going to sweep the country, as the Attorney General just expressed his concern about?
There is mounting concern about that, Terry, from advocates, from activists that I spoke to. I think a lot of people say that they knew that this was coming, but the reality of it setting in was really chilling for a lot of the abortion providers, including one who is here at the White House today meeting with Vice President Kamala Harris, Dr. Kumar, who I interviewed at a Planned Parenthood clinic in Texas. He said that he was doing 20 to 30 abortions a day, but when that law went into effect, he only saw 6 patients. He had to turn half of them away. I talked to another healthcare worker at that same Planned Parenthood talking about their call center being flooded with calls. It turned into a crisis hotline, she told me. She told me about one story about a woman who came in for just an annual checkup. She was tested. She discovered that she was 5.5 weeks pregnant, so she could have gone through with that abortion, but also turns out she tested positive for COVID. So because of the mandatory period of self-isolation, by the time that is over with, she will be too far along to actually go through with an abortion in the state of Texas. She said that she was crying, begging for someone to help her, that she just could not believe that this was the new reality for her and for other women in Texas. But most certainly this does show, Terry, as you know, the conservative strength on the bench. This all points back to that. You know, President Trump, former President Donald Trump, appointed 3 judges to the Supreme Court bench. All 3 of them voted to let this law stand as it is. They did not rule, obviously, on whether or not it was constitutional, but they did vote, obviously, they did allow this law to stand as is, Terry.
So, Sarah, what happens next? Could this law, they're asking for an injunction, they say. Could the law be put on hold while this legal battle plays out?
So the first thing will be that a district judge will rule on this one way or the other. Yes, they could issue in this case, statewide injunction of the law, but otherwise it will follow the exact same procedure that previous case did that got to the Supreme Court. It would go to the intermediate appellate court at the 5th Circuit, and then there could be an emergency petition to the Supreme Court. Whether the Supreme Court would step in a second time, pretty unlikely that they would do anything differently here. This lawsuit seems to have a lot of the same defects that the first lawsuit did, and that it's very unclear who you sue here. They've sued the state of Texas, but you'd be asking the federal courts to basically enjoin everyone potentially in the country, which is just an odd posture and a very, as people have pointed out, unique to our legal system, what this law has done to create civil bounties for a federal constitutional right.
And that, as you say, is the weakness of the Justice Department case. The strength is that this is clearly in defiance of the United States Constitution, and there must be a way, short of previous ways of resolving disputes between states and the federal government, of stopping that. And we're going to see how that turns out. Sarah Isgur, Rachel Scott, thanks very much for staying with for being with us. And Mary Alice, I'd like you to stay with us because we're going to shift gears a little bit. President Biden is going to address the nation to announce new executive orders that will require all federal workers and contractors to be vaccinated against COVID-19, as well as a new plan to fight that Delta variant. So, Mary Alice, what's in this 6-point plan of President Biden's to fight the Delta variant?
Well, Terry, like you said, there was the big news today that federal employees would no longer have a choice of either getting a vaccine mandate or submitting to regular testing. Instead, they're going to just have to get vaccinated. White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki said today that they're going to have about 75 days to do that. The enforcement mechanism is going to be done differently at every agency. But she made it clear that people could be terminated or basically not be able to work for the federal government unless they got a COVID vaccine. I think that really the reach of this is going to be that it will include rules and guidelines for federal contractors as well. That obviously greatly expands the pool of Americans that we're talking about, not just federal employees, but federal contractors. Like we saw over the summer, the federal government thinks that they can provide a real example for private entities here. And I think that over the summer, when we saw the federal government say, ask your employees to get a vaccine. If they won't get a vaccine, ask them to wear masks or not travel or have to get regular tests. I think this is the federal government giving the private sector even more clearance to have even stricter mandates in place. We're also expecting the president to talk about schools, money that they've given to schools to try to make sure that there's masking and vaccinations and upgrades to school buildings to help with the Delta variant. But a lot of questions still about what the federal government is going to do with booster shots. And I know that the president is going to be facing a lot of questions if he doesn't have clear guidance on boosters out of his remarks today, Terry.
So, Mary Alice, why did the president wait until now to announce this vaccine requirement for all federal workers? What was he concerned about in bringing this hammer down?
Well, I think that they thought it should be a slow roll, kind of progressive steps. First, let people say if they've already been vaccinated, sort of applaud organizations that were encouraging vaccines. But you're slowly seeing the White House and the federal government take stronger and stronger measures, stricter and stricter measures, more sticks, fewer carrots. I think that the president feels like, and the White House feels like they need to be calling on their enforcement mechanisms, what they have at their disposal, because hospitals are hurting, because so many states are grappling with hospitals that are full and hospitals that are rationing care. They're feeling like they are overwhelmed again, and the government has to be responsive to that. But of course, it's not just a policy part. There's a political part to this, Terry. We know that the president's approval ratings on his handling of COVID have really fallen this summer by some polls, by some of our own polls, fallen as much as 10 points over the last few months. So the president feels like both politically and from a policy perspective, he has to do something to show that he is working to try to get this pandemic under control in a way that Americans thought it was. We look back to those 4th of July comments the president made where it seemed to say that we're rounding the corner here, and he wants the country to feel like that again.
Yeah, he needs it politically, but we do have to get on top of it. Mary Alice Parks, thanks.
And as we wait to hear from the president on his new 6-part strategy to fight the Delta variant, let's talk to emergency medical physician Dr. Darian Sutton for a little bit more on what we expect to hear from the president. And Dr. Sutton, what is it that you're looking to hear from the president today during this speech?
Personally, clear and concise messaging regarding what are our next steps during this pandemic, especially in this surge in the setting of the Delta variant. I'm expecting that he's going to share information about the mandate. And just to be clear, mandating about vaccines is not mandating to get vaccinated. It's mandating to make a decision. Because if you choose not to get vaccinated, you are at a higher risk of contracting COVID-19 and transmitting it to the people around you. So it's clear that, and it's obvious that your access to the community, public spaces, and workplaces can't be the same if you are not vaccinated, because you pose a higher risk to the community.
Now, the U.S. is heading into the fall with 4 times more patients in hospitals than a year ago. And just a few months ago, as Mary Alice mentioned, President Biden was celebrating independence from COVID on July 4th. Things at that time seemed like they were getting better. So do you think that was a premature celebration? And how does America get back to a place where we're moving toward normalcy again?
I think COVID is proving to be exceptional, especially with the variant, especially the Delta variant that we are now combating. As we have seen in other countries, variants are created by increases in transmission. The Delta variant first emerged in India, where there was a massive amount of cases and transmission. And unfortunately, we're going to continue to see that with COVID-19. That is inevitable. I think early in the summer, when the variant was low in its percentage and the amount of cases that we were seeing, we had a really good outlook. But unfortunately, science changes and COVID changes. So when COVID acts exceptional, our mitigation efforts need to be exceptional in terms of vaccinating all of those who are eligible, masking those who are in high-risk environments, and making sure that we protect everyone who can't get vaccinated for one reason or another.
And as kids head back to school, children now account for 1 in 4 of all new COVID cases. Los Angeles is even considering becoming the first major school district in the country to mandate vaccines for children 12 and older. What do you make of that?
I think it's really important to acknowledge the fact that children are the most vulnerable right now. I've been watching these cases rise, and I've been treating patients inside of the emergency room. We're fortunate enough to see that although the number of cases of children is increasing, the percentage of those who are hospitalized is staying the same. So the Delta variant is not proving to be more harmful, but it is showing that those who are unvaccinated are vulnerable. And unfortunately, children under the age of 12 are the most vulnerable at this point. And I think in terms of vaccinating those who are over the age of 12, we can see clearly that COVID-19 provides incredible amounts of risk, not just an infection, but the association to its complications, to name a few, such as myocarditis, pericarditis, blood clots in the lungs, such as pulmonary embolisms, strokes, and heart attacks. All of these complications are substantially higher with COVID-19. And when you compare them to the rare risk of the vaccine, it seems clear the benefit is obvious. So we need to make sure that all of those who are eligible need to get vaccinated.
All right, and there were a lot of concerns about a surge from Labor Day weekend. When do you think we'll see the impact from that weekend, if there is one?
Well, usually history can help us understand this. Usually after holiday weekends, when you have a lot of people congregating, and especially without masks and unvaccinated, you can see changes in the rates of cases, hospitalizations, and deaths 2 to 3 to 4 weeks after. I am hopeful, given the fact that we have vaccines in the game, that we won't see those associated increases in hospitalizations and deaths, but I do expect that we'll see an increase in cases.
We're also learning now that President Biden also plans to require all businesses with more than 100 employees to require vaccinations or weekly COVID testing. Now, that covers roughly 2/3 of the U.S. workforce. What kind of effect could that have?
I think it's going to provide a monumental effect in terms of protection to those who are vulnerable. When we think about the vaccine, it is decreasing your risk of contracting COVID-19, and it's substantially decreasing your risk of having symptomatic COVID-19, and it more than 25 times decreases your risk of being hospitalized. And what everyone needs to understand is that if you get vaccinated, you can help decrease the risk even better than what we've seen before. And so I can accept the fact that many people may still want to deliberate, but we have to make sure that everyone understands that if you choose not to get vaccinated, you yourself are carrying that higher risk, and you can't be upset when someone doesn't want to sit next to you in a workplace or sit next to you in a restaurant when you're unvaccinated. So I'm hopeful that many people will come around to understanding the benefit of these vaccines.
All right, Dr. Darian Sutton, always great to have you. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, well, set your fantasy lineups. The NFL season kicks off tonight in Tampa, Florida, where the defending Super Bowl champion Buccaneers take on the Dallas Cowboys, and a new season means, well, new COVID protocols from Major League Sports. This year, if a game is canceled because of an outbreak among unvaccinated players, that team will be forced to forfeit. ESPN's Ed Werder is at Raymond James Stadium in Tampa with a look at tonight's matchup.
When Tom Brady and his Tampa Bay team played the final game of the season here in February, they won a world championship in front of the smallest crowd in Super Bowl history because of COVID restrictions. Tonight, they play the very first game of the new season, and it'll be with the stadium full, even though the U.S. has 4 times more COVID patients in hospitals than a year ago. NFL Chief Medical Officer Dr. Alan Sills tells ESPN that with the vaccine, he believes teams have the ability to turn COVID into a seasonal illness rather than a devastating pandemic, and he expects fewer outbreaks this season. Although his team's 100% vaccinated, Brady's predicted it'll be more challenging this year, and it seems tonight's opponent, the Dallas Cowboys, are proving validity to his argument. Despite having just 3 players who have not at least begun the vaccine sequence, the Cowboys are missing a key player, offensive guard Zach Martin, because he tested positive last Saturday and remains on the COVID-19 reserve list. Diane and Terry, back to you.
All right, ESPN's Ed Werder in Tampa. Thanks very much for that. Go Bears. Well, coming up as we approach the anniversary of the attacks on 9/11, we're going to speak with the then governor of New York, George Pataki, hear what he calls a failure in the aftermath of those attacks and his take on where we are 20 years later.
Welcome back. As we approach the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks, we commemorate not just that fateful day, but the slow and painful recovery process. Then Governor George Pataki was one of those charged with aiding in search and rescue efforts and guiding the state of New York through the aftermath of the attack. And Governor Pataki joins us now with a look back. Governor, thanks so much for being here. I'm curious, what's your most vivid memory from that day?
The most vivid memory to me, there are 2. First is when I saw the towers actually come down, and you have this horrific sense of loss of how many wonderful people are trapped in those towers and going to be died in the rubble. And then the second is that evening when I was down at Ground Zero with the flames rising from the pile, and the air, you could taste it, you could see it. It wasn't like it was clear air from the East River to the Hudson River. The sky was full of rubble and dust and debris, and it was just a scene out of Dante's Inferno. And those are just 2 horrific images from that day that will always be with me.
Now, a lot of the first responders who were at Ground Zero that day, of course, are now facing serious health problems as a consequence of the toxic dust at that site that you're referring to. So when you look back, do you think there was a failure to protect the health of our first responders there?
I think there's a failure to give them sufficient warning that what they were doing was extremely dangerous. You know, we were told the air quality was okay, and obviously it wasn't. And that day, and 24 hours a day for weeks and months thereafter, firefighters, construction workers, citizens, EMTs were on that pile, on the rubble, risking their lives to try to first save their fellow human beings and ultimately recover as many remains as possible. And they were incredibly courageous. They really inspired not just New York, I think they inspired America and the world. And now too many of them are sick. Some have died. And it's because that air quality wasn't what it had been represented. So I think we owe them not just a debt of gratitude, we owe them all our help with medical treatments, with examinations, and support for the families.
And I know on that note, you recently called for more funding to aid in that help that you're describing. Do you think enough has been done for those who were affected by their work on 9/11 and in the weeks and months after?
You know, I don't think you could ever do enough for the people who responded with such courage on September 11th. There was a lot of doubt as to what the future was going to be. We didn't know if there were going to be more attacks. We didn't know if America was going to be the same country after it. And yet people watched night and day and saw that courage, saw that strength under horrible conditions. And so we can never do enough for them, not just remembering them, as I believe we've appropriately done at Ground Zero, at the memorial, but helping them and their families as they go forward with these health consequences.
So what does this 20th anniversary mean to you, and how will you commemorate it?
You know, this is a tough one. They're all tough. I'll be down at Ground Zero as the names are read and the bells are rung when the planes hit and the towers came down. And as I have for 20 years, I'll see family members who I've gotten to know and will hug, shed a few tears, and I'll see firefighters and EMTs and police who I saw down there day after day after the planes hit, and we'll hug and say hi to each other. But I had really hoped that 20 years later, I could look to the future and say, aren't we in a great place? And if you look at Lower Manhattan, we are. The memorial is something that turned out exactly as I had hoped. It honors the memories of those who died. It tells the story to those who weren't born on September 11th. And it does so in a moving and appropriate way. And yet we still have enormous commerce that's a spire of office towers culminating in the Freedom Tower. And I thought that 20 years later, America hasn't been attacked. We've denied the jihadists any sort of a victory after September 11th. But I have to say that I am just enormously troubled by Biden's actions in Afghanistan. I think they have inspired jihadists and those who hate America around the globe with greater desire to do damage to us and our friends. I fear it has scared our allies that they might not be able to longer feel that they can trust us when things get difficult. So I had hoped that this would be kind of a closure where 20 years we have rebuilt. We have this wonderful memorial and commerce back in 24-hour community in Lower Manhattan, and we are safe. We can say all the first part, but I'm no longer sure we can say that last part.
All right. Former New York Governor George Pataki, we appreciate your time today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Nice being on with you.
And all this week, we're examining what America is and what we've become in the aftermath of September 11th with a 5-part documentary series, a collaboration between ABC News Live and ABC's investigative unit. Tonight, we take a hard look at the role of Guantanamo Bay after 9/11 in housing suspected terrorists captured in the so-called global war on terror. And we hear from former Guantanamo detainee Lakhdar Boumediene. Boumediene's story begins when he was brought into a Bosnian police station back in October 2001, right after the attacks, for questioning about an alleged bombing plot.
The guard, he brought me some paperwork. He told me, you're innocent. You can get out. Sign here and take your stuff home.
And then a dramatic scene erupted outside. A heavy presence of police in riot gear mobilized at the jail. Instead of releasing Boumediene and the 5 other men, officers brought them to vans.
And at that moment, it was shocking. I saw people wearing hoods, with dogs, handcuffs. Afterwards, they blindfolded me, covered my ears, handcuffed me.
In protest, nearly 300 relatives and supporters tried to block the vans from leaving.
I heard some Bosnian language, but they were Americans.
And then, the 6 men were handed off to U.S. forces.
Our soldiers, working with the Bosnian government, seized terrorists who were plotting to bomb our embassy.
Boumediene and the other accused men, known as the Algerian 6, were flown to Guantanamo Bay. They were among the camp's first detainees, arriving during its 2nd week of operation.
The day when I opened my eyes in cell, I am shocked.
Well, ABC's chief investigative reporter Josh Margolin joins us now with more on tonight's episode. Josh, I want to start with where Boumediene just leaves off there in that clip. He says he was shocked when he opened his eyes at Gitmo. You've been there. I was there about 15 years ago as well, right after they opened it to reporters. Tell us, describe what that place is, what it's like, and what shocks you about what went on there.
Well, first of all, Terry, you know, the detention facility that has become so controversial is usually off limits to reporters. Some of us have gotten limited tours, but the high value detainees, as they call them, the highest maximum security detainees, we can't see the facilities that they're actually in. That's just for them and the Red Cross, and I think their lawyers can go in. But Gitmo writ large is a very, very strange environment, and I'm sure you were struck when you first went down there. Parts of the camp, remember, it's a U.S. naval base and has been for 100 years. Parts of it are no different than an Army town or a Navy town somewhere in Florida or Alabama. You have a McDonald's, you have a general store, you have a pub, you have all sorts of military folks, you have schools for the kids. Very, very normal. But then you get to the high security portion of the camp by the court complex, and that's obviously where they bring the detainees, and it's very, very strange. It's set up like it's a forward operating base in Afghanistan or Iraq. They don't have permanent buildings to house the attorneys or the office space or the reporters that are out there to cover these various hearings. It's very, very strange, and it's very remote. When you're there, the first thing that strikes you is, even though it's a long-standing U.S. military facility, and obviously there's high-tech communications between the Navy operations there and back in Washington and back in Florida, the communications and the access that we as civilian observers have, really next to nothing. It was always very, very strange to be there.
And they've closed down that camp now, where most of the prisoners were being held, because it was falling apart. It's gone on so long, it's falling apart. So the Bush administration was covering it back then. They felt the need to go to such extremes in our law, extraordinary renditions in the middle of the night, as we just saw, secret prisons, brutal interrogations that by any fair definition are torture. You know, at the end of the day, why do you think they did that?
Well, the real benefit of the work that we've done over the last 8 months in putting together this documentary series has been has been the research. You know, we don't have to guess. We actually went back to people like Alberto Gonzales, who was the White House counsel, then the Attorney General, to John Bellinger, who was the chief attorney for the National Security Council, to Andy Card, who was President Bush's chief of staff at the time. And we asked all of these questions. You know, they have a logical explanation for what occurred. And the bottom line of it was, they wanted to take the people detained in the war on terror in Afghanistan and later Iraq. They wanted to get them to a place that was secure, that was remote, where they could then interrogate them. From there, though, a lot of other kinds of questionable decisions were made. And in fact, John Bellinger, who was the National Security Council chief attorney, he said at the time, the first point was not really controversial. Use Gitmo. That's okay. And at that point, Gitmo was really best known for just being, you know, in A Few Good Men. It really wasn't known as a controversial location. But then the other things, when you start hearing about these extraordinary renditions in the middle of the night, you hear about the aggressive interrogation techniques that have been termed by many fair-minded people, like you say, torture. And we go through that tonight in the episode. We have actually a really, really stark interview with the first military attorney who raised questions about the type of interrogation techniques. And he sent a memo back to Washington that said, this is just wrong, it shouldn't be done. We have the FBI Assistant General Counsel, who actually raised these questions with the Pentagon, with the Justice Department at the time. And of course, we have Lakhdar Boumediene, who suffered through the interrogation techniques. And it's important to know there are some people that are held now at Gitmo who are suspected terrorists. There are some people who have actually pleaded guilty to terrorism charges. Lakhdar Boumediene, in the end, he was not a terrorist. He was released by a federal judge after the government had showed that they had no evidence or reason to keep him.
And obviously the reason that the government chose Gitmo is because at that time they thought it was outside the jurisdiction of the federal courts, so they thought they could get away with things there. That is one of the original sins of all this. What's incredible, so I've been covering this week the trial of accused 9/11 mastermind Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and other of the top value detainees. He just had pretrial motions heard this week. I witnessed them out at Fort Meade, 2 decades after the attack, 20 years. So what does that tell you about these military tribunals and what the original decision to take these high-value detainees out of our legal system torture them, essentially, and then try to put them back in, and the mess that it's made.
Look, it absolutely is a mess. By any fair reading of what's gone on, it's absolutely a mess. And we actually interviewed Matt Olson, who has been nominated by President Biden to run the National Security Division at the Justice Department. He was President Obama's point man on closing Gitmo, and he says it directly. It is a failure. The whole thing has become a failure, and it's terrible. And the families tell us that they want us to know that 20 years later, justice delayed is justice denied. But we know, you and I both know, and the people that cover it know, that even as it falls out of the headlines, there is really no sense that this trial is going to take place this year, next year, the year after. No one really knows. It's entirely possible that we could get to the 25th anniversary and potentially not have any more clarity on this.
And it's in part because those original brutal interrogation techniques, they don't want them in that courtroom. And the effort to try to put this genie back in the bottle is just making it very complicated, as you say, Josh Margolin.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much,
Terry. Thank you so much
with us.
Appreciate it.
And you can catch episode 4 of the 5-part docuseries tonight at 8:30 Eastern on ABC News Live. Episodes of 9/11, 20 years later, The Longest Shadow, premiere all week on Hulu. And that does it for the breakdown today. Thanks for joining us. I'm Terry Moran. We'll see you back here at 3 p.m. Eastern tomorrow. Have a great day.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.